Ladies and gentlemen, once more I'll be talking about the hemeoxygenase system and diabetes this time. Not probably I talked about hypertension yesterday. And what I would present today is not actually a very new publication from my lab. It is a combination of a few studies which were done by one of my past PhD students, graduate, and a few new data which was added. So the novelty is there, but probably not as compelling as maybe some of the directions we would intend to take in future. So I wouldn't want to sound very repetitive. We all know the problem with diabetes, how its escalation has been dramatically increasing in recent times. And the interesting thing, or the unfortunate thing, is that we know that this increase in diabetes also always comes, as a consequence of it being probably one of the underlying risk factors for other complications. So some chronic conditions like obesity are generally considered maybe a state of continuous or a continuum of inflammation which eventually might lead to type 2 diabetes. Even though diabetes generally has increased dramatically, it is the type 2 which is even more at an alarming rate, because type 1 diabetes is still relatively low compared to type 2. Another chronic condition that would actually affect or linkage between type 2 diabetes and another chronic disease is the relationship between hypertension and diabetes. So it's like 20% of the general population with hypertension would eventually become diabetic. And that's also true, the reverse. Patients with diabetes who start with diabetes at some point in their life, they might also become hypertensive. So the underlying mechanism for this probably is maybe the vasculature, the endothelium, which of course, you know that the endothelium is very critical in both conditions. Nitric oxide comes from the endothelium. Nitric oxide is important for dilation of vessels, glucose uptake, effective metabolism, effective glucose disposal. The endothelium, on the other hand, of course, is responsible to balance relaxation of vascular smooth muscles as well as constriction. So that link between hypertension and diabetes makes it very, very probable that whoever comes first does not mean that's the end of your nightmare, as I would describe it. Might continue. And then 60% of people with diabetes, they would eventually have hypertension. So all of this is just kind of indicating why any of these chronic conditions, obesity, diabetes, or hypertension, I don't want to talk about insulin resistance because that's already involved in all of these cases here. They're all those people with type 2 diabetic. Most of them are always insulin resistant, although you know that there are some people with type 2 diabetes who may have dysfunction of just some other related pathways to insulin signaling and not directly on the receptor itself, but further downstream. So one of the biggest drivers of pathophysiological forces is high oxygen free radicals and increased inflammation. Of course, both of these conditions play a wide role in several diseases. And again, in the condition of overt diabetes, where you have hyperglycemia, once glucose is not metabolized adequately, then of course that is transformed into advanced glycation end products, And from advanced glycation end products, then you have that intermediary where then you start activating RAGE receptors, and then you eventually get lots of activation of other oxidative stress or oxidative signaling, as well as inflammatory signaling. So you get into a vicious cycle just when you start having hyperglycemia. Now, I would like to just to spend a few words here to say that hyperglycemia caused as a result of postprandial hyperglycemia when we just eat, or some people are not able to bring back their glucose level to norm immediately after meals, and so they stay for a much longer period. Now, this is the condition which goes to be very poorly detected medically. Because most of the time, what do your GPs tell you to do? Or what do they do? Fasting glucose. So the overnight glucose levels, but then you don't know what is happening immediately after your meals. And so it will be critical to understand exactly what and how effective you can actually normalize your glucose levels after every meal. Now, one of the consequences of elevated oxidative stress and inflammation is the rupture or the breakdown of adiponectin, which is an insulin sensitizing peptide, as well as insulin itself. Insulin itself can be destroyed by oxidative stress. So, again, we use the hemeoxygenase system, to try to see what its contribution towards improving this condition can be like. I wouldn't spend a lot of time here because yesterday it was basically the same aspect of what hemeoxygenase does. You have two isoforms, HO1 and HO2. So most of our studies will be based on using this substance, hemine, to induce HO1, and then we see the consequence of the products like bilirubin, bilivedin, and the ferritin, which of course are products which are produced from that catabolic degradation of heme by hemeoxygenase. So because we know that oxidative stress depletes adiponectin and insulin, we investigated whether the HO system would attenuate the oxidative destruction of adiponectin and insulin and would then lead to the improvement of insulin sensitivity in a streptozotocin-induced model. Now, I know all the criticism that exists out there about the streptozotocin-induced model. It is not an excellent model of diabetes. It is by itself an inducer of many different what they call regenerative factors. It is not like, in terms of ideal conditions, it is not a model which replicates what actually happens in type 1 diabetes in humans. Because type 1 diabetes in humans is autoimmune, but this one is actual destruction. It's not caused by any inflammatory or any... So I know the criticism. I know it's not a good model for diabetes, but we are just using it. So we measured fasting glucose level after we induced streptozotocin diabetes. And you can see this is the STZ is the streptozotocin-induced diabetes. The fasting glucose levels are very high. These two are controlled. Just the Sprague Dolly SD is the normal rat, and then the SD rat was also treated with citrate because you dissolve this streptozotocin in citrate, so those two were control groups. And then you have this elevated fasting glucose level, which we observed in the streptozotocin-induced diabetic animal. Once we gave hemine to that animal, it brought down the glucose level, and then we waited for 3 months without giving any further treatment. We call it post-hemine. We see that the glucose level was still significantly low, even though it had gone up slightly. But then if we use the hemeoxygenase blocker, we reversed the anti-diabetic effect. And if we use the hemeoxygenase blocker alone, the anti-diabetic effect is exacerbated. And of course, you also gave just the vehicle alone, which was used in dissolving the drugs, that is hemine and CRMP. That vehicle was also given to the streptozotocin model, and you see that it had no effect. So panel B actually shows you a time factor as the decrease in glucose occurred week after week as we gave treatment. So we actually gave treatment for up to 4 weeks before we attained the desirable levels of glucose, which is normal. Now, as I mentioned, we also looked at postprandial level because not just fasting level is sufficient. So we looked at the fasting hyperglycemia, and we observed exactly the same effect that we saw with fasting glucose level. Then we went to look at the effect of hemine in skeletal muscles. Well, you know that skeletal muscles are largely responsible for glucose uptake. And you have different types of skeletal muscles. You have the gastrocnemius, you have the soleus muscle. So we chose the soleus muscle, which is a highly oxidative muscle. You could criticize that. Why did I decide to choose a highly oxidative muscle rather than going for a much more less normal muscle like the gastrocnemius? That's a fair argument. But since we had already published with the gastrocnemius muscle, we wanted to try a different type of muscle in this case, and which is still skeletal. So if you observe, when we gave hemine treatment, it significantly increased the depleted levels which you had in the streptozotocin-induced diabetic model. After hemine treatment, it went significantly up. And then the animal that received hemine treatment and then was kept for 3 months without further therapy still had its level fairly high. And these levels were comparable with the levels which you get when you just give hemine treatment to a normal, healthy SD animals. Then, of course, the HO inhibitor, of course, abrogated the effect, and then it was actually exacerbated when you gave the CRMP alone, which is, of course, the blocker for hemeoxygenase. And then a similar observation was made for HO activity, which is now a sum of HO1 and HO2 and HO3. So we just got a mirror image, which I wouldn't spend so much time on. So we went further to look at the effects on cyclic GMP. I told you yesterday that cyclic GMP is also involved in insulin signaling, and how specifically. Now, recent publications and data out there show that cyclic GMP actually enhances insulin sensitivity. This would cause vascular smooth muscles to relax. If vascular smooth muscles relax, more blood flows to them, and if there is more blood, then you're going to have increased glucose uptake by GLUT4 receptors wherever they are found. And so you need, a general consideration. Every single drug that causes vasodilation, that is, think about almost all the antihypertensives, most of them would be beneficial for people with insulin resistance because it would enhance glucose uptake. So physicians should always have this into consideration. You might give a drug and then you have multiple beneficial effects just because of what I call converging metabolic synergy. So we wanted to know what are some of the common proteins which are modified when we give hemine treatment. So we did a 2D gel electrophoresis, or what you call proteomics experiment, in which the animals which are treated with hemine and the control animal, all these different numbers are the different gel spots which were visualized. And then subsequently we use mass cut analysis and mass spectrometry specifically to identify those different spots. And then we gave them specific names which came from the mass spectrometry. As you can see, wherever you have an H, that is an animal that received hemine. If you have a C, it's an animal that was just a control. So these were the changes in 18 different spots which we kind of selected. And if you look carefully, you see that most of those spots have to do with either diabetes, obesity, hypertension and diabetes. So most of the major factors which were actually proteins which are actually modified when you give hemine treatment still come back to the proteins which are centered around oxidative stress. You see, there's a lot of catalase, there is a lot of glutathione, there is a lot of, well, the heat shock protein 70 is very similar to hemeoxygenase. Actually, that was the protein which was initially discovered before hemeoxygenase, because hemeoxygenase is also known as heat shock, but it's called heat shock 32, while heat shock 70 is the one which was for a long time known before eventually hemeoxygenase was fully characterized. So these are some of the common modifications that take place. And therefore, because we saw that many proteins related to oxidative stress were actually either upregulated, most of them were, so we went to measure the specific proteins which typically characterize oxidative stress, which come from the hemeoxygenase system. In this regard, we actually measured bilirubin. As I told you, when you give hemine, it breaks down circulating heme and converts that circulating heme into bilirubin. Bilirubin is a potent antioxidant. And if you go and see what the levels of bilirubin in the streptozotocin-induced diabetic rats were, they were low, but after hemine treatment, it went up. And then, again, this treatment with the HO inhibitor reversed the trend, whereas if you give just the HO inhibitor alone, it actually further depleted the basal HO activity. So a similar observation was made for ferritin, which is another protein which is generated by the HO system. And therefore, after having observed that, we then measured the level of superoxide dismutase, and we got similar trend. So this means that we are looking at the overall, or what someone might describe as the total antioxidant capacity of the animal might have been modified after hemine treatment. If you are actually boosting the antioxidant capacity, then it means that there is a specific assay which you could use to determine the total antioxidant capacity, and that assay actually is what we did, and then we got a similar trend as well. Then we went further to measure the levels of oxidative stress, 8-isoprostane, in the solus muscle. You see that in the diabetic animal, it was very high. After we gave hemine treatment, it came down, and it stayed low even after the post-treatment, whereas the HO inhibitor reversed the trend. Similarly, we measured urinary 8-isoprostane, which would give you the overall levels of oxidative stress in the animal, and it was a similar trend like what we saw in the solus muscle. Now, because the HO1 gene, as you can see, it actually harbors binding sites for other oxidative transcription factors like AP1 and AP2. And similarly, another potent pro-inflammatory oxidative transcription factor like NF-kappa B, you also have motifs for these in the HO1 gene. So we speculated that if these oxidative transcription factors are found on HO1 gene, the HO system might be able to modify this. So we used RT-PCR and measured NF-kappa B in the different treatment groups. You see that in the diabetic animals, the levels were extremely high. After hemine treatment, it came low, it was suppressed, and it stayed low after 3 months of post-treatment, whereas it was reversed by the HO inhibitor. A similar observation was made for AP1 and C-junk, and we know that C-junk is actually what depletes insulin production. And this protein also binds to serine and actually causes insulin resistance. And then AP2, which is also an oxidative transcription factor, followed a similar trend like nuclear kappa factor B. Now, after having observed all the pro-oxidative and inflammatory damaging effects of found in this diabetic model, we went to look at pancreatic tissue. So this is a normal, healthy pancreatic tissue from a healthy SD rat. There is no evident damage at all. When you give streptozotocin treatment, you see that there is significant increase in vacuolization, there is oedema, there is acinar cell necrosis, there is mononuclear cell infiltration. So you really cause very, very significant damage. When you treat those animals with hemine, you significantly improve the overall pathophysiological profile. But when you block, or when you give the HO inhibitor, when you block the effects of hemine, you reverse the trend once more, and you go back to serious damage. So we then used morphological assay to quantify all those damages, from interstitial edema to fibrosis. As you can see, all the values for the streptozotocin-induced diabetic animals are significantly elevated compared to the SD control, but when you give hemine treatment, those values are much improved. And therefore, we could say that in the streptozotocin-induced diabetic animal, that severe inflammation was evident, and this was characterized by significant elevation of mononuclear cell infiltration, as well as increased interstitial edema, and there was more pronounced acinar cell necrosis and fibrosis. All of these were completely reversed after you give the HO inducer hemine. So we also measured insulin or glucose intolerance, and I wouldn't spend a lot of time on this because I talked about that yesterday. So glucose tolerance was greatly improved, as well as insulin tolerance after treatment. Then we went further to measure AMPK. Now, AMPK is very, very important for insulin sensitivity, and this molecule is not only activated by hemine or the HO system. This is actually one of the pathways through which metformin actually elicits its anti-diabetic effects by activating AMPK. And this pathway can also be activated by nitric oxide. So AMPK is very important for enhancing insulin sensitivity. So as you can see in the diabetic animals, that level was low, but after we measured it in the animals that received hemine treatment post-therapy, that is after 3 months of treatment, it was significantly elevated, whereas if you give the HO inhibitor, the levels were abrogated. Similarly, other proteins which are implicated in glucose metabolism, like GLUT4, and both RT-PCR and the actual quantification of the protein showed significant improvement when you give hemine treatment. So we would summarize these observations by saying that the suppression of pancreatic histopathological lesions were accompanied by increased insulin production, and that hemine potentiated agents implicated in insulin sensitization and glucose metabolism, such as adiponectin, AMPK, cyclic GMP, and GLUT4. These were actually accompanied by reduced glucose tolerance, decreased insulin tolerance, and then, of course, reduced insulin resistance, which, of course, means insulin sensitivity was improved. So we conclude that by concomitantly enhancing insulin and paradoxically potentiating insulin sensitivity, this study unveils a novel, unique, long-lasting anti-diabetic effect characteristic of upregulating HO with hemine that could be explored against insulin-resistant and insulin-dependent diabetes. So why I say paradoxically here is just because you are increasing insulin levels, but at the same time, you are increasing insulin sensitivity. Not many drugs can do that. And so that is why that was unique. And that's the end of this, unless I have to thank those who work in my lab. This was taken about 4 years ago. So I had all these who kind of helped to put up the study that you're seeing. So thank you very much.